Yeah, I've been waiting for this.
What's up everyone, it's Press Any Button and here we are with another part of our action adventure series. Now today we're going to be working on terrain and I'm just going to run through all the tools that you can use in terraining your levels to make sure that they look visually impressive and to also just have some fun with some level design. Now, as the title has suggested in previous parts, this is more of a demo than a full game that we're trying to make. So this will just give you the foundation for moving ahead. As you can see here, I've got a terrain, it's got some hills. If we zoomed in, we can see that it's got some grass and some trees. And in fact, we'll get a close look at it right now. And you can see that it looks pretty alright. So we've got grass, and if you look at the grass carefully, you can actually see that the grass moves. So there's like a little bit of a wind effect there. We've got some trees that vary in detail depending on how far or how close we are from them. So we'll figure out how to set that up. And we've got this little dojo type thing that I've set up with my enemy here. No colliders on this dojo yet, but that can be something that we explore in a future part. Let's get straight into it because this is going to be an absolute speed run of everything that we're going to do. So let me get to the same point where you guys are at. So you'll have a terrain set up that's going to have the platform tag and everything because that's where we've been testing out our game so far. I'm just going to right click in the hierarchy, go to 3D object and then select terrain. I'm going to make sure that the terrain is set to origin, which it should be by default, so no problems there because we don't want our character just falling off of the world. We want to make sure that it's lined up properly. And then we go over to the tags and we select platform. Now, one thing that we're going to do immediately is go to terrain settings, this little tab here, and we can manipulate the size of our terrain. Right now it is absolutely mahoosive, which is something you might want, but that's not something I want currently. So I'm going to set the width and the length to 200, and you can see that it's just done that there. If I click on my character and then hit F in the scene view, I'll be able to zoom in and I can see that my character is on the terrain and they won't fall off of that. Sweet, nothing new there. So let's get to the new stuff. We're going to go over to another tab under terrain and take a look at the create neighbor terrains tool. Now the create neighbor terrains tool just does what it says on the can. You can just create neighboring terrains, which is pretty good. These terrains, mind you, don't have the platform tag as default. They'll just be untagged by default. So you'll want to apply that. It's not something that we're going to use today because as you may find in your own project, it gets a bit glitchy when we have these multiple terrains because the ground check doesn't recognize them properly even when they are tagged as platform. So I would just recommend using the terrain settings to manipulate the size of your terrain. Now we go over to the paint terrain tab. And under paint terrain, we're going to go to raise or lower terrain. It's probably here by default for you guys. I've just been messing around with it. And this tool is actually how you get to mold your terrain, as it were. So you see I just click there and I can raise my terrain. Depending on which brush I use, it'll raise in a different way. So I get more spikes on that one, get a flat disc on this one. If I want a star, I can select that. And so that's pretty fun to mess around with. What we'll do is we'll go to this brush, which you should have by default. It's a built-in brush. We'll manipulate the brush size a little bit. So I'm going to bump it up to about 70 or 69. And then we'll leave the opacity where it is. The opacity actually affects the height of it. So just to demonstrate, if I do that, you can see that this is a greater raise on the terrain than this. But I'm going to leave the opacity around about 60 where we had it and create a little trail for my character. So just click along, nothing too difficult with this part, just experiment, as I say, try these things in your own projects and see what works. So what I'm going for here is a little canyon or a valley that our character is going to run through, and I'm doing these individual clicks, but what I can also do is I can hold and drag for more of an extreme effect. So if you really want to just quickly raise stuff, I definitely recommend you holding and dragging. But for my own practice, I would say click around first, make sure you get your positioning right for where you want your hills, and then go into dragging. Now our character's disappeared, and that's no good. Our terrain's looking pretty epic though, but we really need our character to be playable in this game. So what we'll do is we'll lower the terrain because he's been swallowed up by the terrain. He is under it, and we can remedy that. We'll go over to this brush that I've selected, and I'm going to lower the brush size, keeping the opacity the same. I'm going to lower it to around about 16 because I want to create a trail within this canyon. If I hit shift and I click, then I can actually subtract away from the height that I created. So this is the lower effect. This is the lower part of the raise and lower tool. And that little dot that I can see there, you might not be able to see it, but that little dot there is my character. So I successfully raised and lowered the terrain. Bro, let's move on to the next bit. So the next bit is applying some color to our terrain. Now we can do this pretty easily. What you'll need to do is you'll need to get a PNG of a texture that you'd like to use. So I've got this grass texture here. And this grass texture is literally me just going into Photoshop, using the paint bucket to create a green square, and then just doing some paint brush strokes to simulate some kind of a texture. I believe the resolution that I used was 1080 by 1080. Works out pretty well for me. If you want a higher resolution, then go ahead, but make it square and make it so that you can repeat this pattern, because this texture won't be stretched over this giant terrain. It will be repeated. From a distance, it'll look a little janky, but when you're actually in the game and down there, it looks a lot better. And there are some practices and things that we can do to make it look a little less samey. So make sure you've got a texture imported. Go over to terrain again, and we're going to go to edit terrain layers and create layer. Then we're going to double click and select the grass texture that we just created in whatever photo editing software or Google search you got it from. And you can see that my terrain is now green, which is awesome. But I don't want my terrain to look all, incredible hulky like this. Just one tone, high saturation. Not really good for what we're going for. So I'm just gonna add some dry features to this. How are we gonna do that? Well, I'll go to edit terrain layers again, then I'll go to create layer. And at this point, you'll want to import another texture, put it in your assets folder or whatever folder you've got set up for that. And for me, I created this sort of like dirt rock texture. So just a brown square, again, with a couple of paint splodges. Double click that and we have our new terrain layer. But oh no, it doesn't look like anything's happened. Well, here's the beauty. The first layer is going to cover the entirety of our terrain, and then the second layer we actually get to have a little bit more control on where the texture is used. So I'm going to lower the brush to about 16, and then I'm going to rip on right through. And there we have it. We have a little bit of a dirt trail for our character to run along. So we figured out how we use the textures, how we paint our terrain, and how we raise and lower our terrain. Now let's add some details to our terrain. What are we going to do to do that? We'll go to paint details. Now before we start messing around with the paint details tab, we're going to need to do something, and that is create a grass texture. Now, not the same kind of grass texture that we have here, but a grass texture that actually pops up from out of the ground, something like this. So this texture I just created messing around with some gradients and stuff, but we're going to hop into Photoshop and I'll show you how you can create that by giving you a simple run through. Okay, so off of a Blue Peter type beat, I've created this texture beforehand. Essentially what I did was I deleted the background layer. So pretend this is the background layer. I'll select it and delete it. And yeah, we delete that layer, so that we have a clear image. So when you have this grid, you have a clear image. Because we're going to export this as a PNG, we need some white spaces, and we don't want those white spaces to be occupied like on a JPEG. We want them to be empty so that we can have some actual shape to our grass. At this point, I just pick a color for my grass texture, Now that I've selected my color, I'm just going to make some blades of grass. So stuff that sticks out of the ground. It's real quick. And what I found worked well is I go for a deeper color and have some grass in the background too. That'll do. And of course, if you don't have the means of doing that, then what you can also do is just import some grass blade texture from a Google search, and that should help you out. So with this texture, I'm going to go to File, Save As, and then save it as a PNG. And so you can see this is my assets folder, and that's where I'm going to save this grass. Now I'm going to select the terrain again, go over to Paint Details again, and we are going to go to Edit Details, Add Grass Texture, not Mesh, but Texture. I'm going to search for the grass texture that we just created. It's going to look a little blocky, a little jank in the preview here, but don't worry about that. We'll leave everything as default and kind of manipulate it if we need to later. I'm gonna click add to add that, and you can see that it looks a lot more proper down here. In terms of the brushes, I would recommend something with sort of specs, nothing with a deep concentration or a solid point, because we don't want to apply too much grass. That's going to take up resources, and that's not something that we want to do. Now, just the same as all of our other brushes, we can mess around with the opacity and the strength and all that stuff. I like to leave the opacity quite low because I like a low concentration of grass. We're just gonna bump up the brush size, and I'm gonna start clicking. You can't see it yet, but if I zoom in, then you would be able to see it if Unity didn't want to do me like that, but it does. So we're just gonna click around. It's grass, so it's not too much of an issue if we get it in random parts. And we could probably remove it later. And here we have our grass, literally the grass that we just created, and it looks fantastic. It's responding to wind apparently, and it's got this billboard effect to it, which is also another great thing for just making sure that we're not using up too many resources. So if you played a game like Super Mario 64, you'll know what billboarding is. If you've ever just been bored and looked at the trees and been climbing on the trees and having fun and stuff, essentially the object is going to look the same no matter where you look at it from. So when I rotate the camera, you can see that all of these blades of grass face us, which is really good. You can also see that there's a varying tone in the grass, and that's from our settings. So when I was adding the grass in Edit Details, if I go over to this grass again and then I choose to edit it, you can see that we have the option for a healthy color and a dry color. We have all of these other options too, so feel free, mess around with those, have fun. Now on to the last bit before this gets way too long. We're going to create some trees, and we're going to work with level of detail, and level of detail means that depending on distances we'll have different levels of detail on our object, and our object is going to be our tree. Without an LOD, we won't be able to create these trees as trees, and I'll run you through that real quick and explain it as we go along. Alright, now here we are in Blender. We're going to speed through creating a tree. I'm going to make a low poly one, and it's just going to be made out of some cubes and a cylinder. So we'll go Shift A, and that will give us our add menu, and I'm going to go over to cylinder. Under add cylinder, just at the bottom here, we get to change the amount of vertices we're going to have. I like to use 5 because it's going to be low poly and we want it nice and clean like that. And then I'm going to go into edit mode on our object. I'm going to hit G and Z because everything's already selected, and I'm bringing the point of origin of our object to about there. So this is the origin point, this orange little dot there, and by dragging it up, I've effectively moved it from the center of the object to here. I did this so it'll look like the tree's coming out of the ground instead of floating on top of the ground when we get around to that. So I'm going to hit tab again to get out of edit mode and back into object mode, S, and then I'm going to hit Shift Z, and that means that I'll be able to scale this object in every axis except from the Z axis, which is exactly what I want. And if you're a bit confused by Z and all these axes, in Unity, up and down is the Y axis, in Blender, up and down is the Z axis, so don't get your ankles broken too much by that. I'm going to scale it up on the Z axis by about 2.5, so a decently sized tree there. And again, I'm just going to hop into edit mode and just sort of drag this up a little bit, depending on my preference. We're going to go into edit mode by hitting the tab key, and I'm going to just drag this along the Z axis, so GZ. Then I'm going to stay in edit mode and I'm going to hit Control R, and that's going to activate the loop cut tool. I'm going to then scroll up on the scroll wheel till I have as many loop cuts as I want, and I'll be able to manipulate the shape of the trunk of our tree using that tool. So now I'm going to hit Z because it opens up a weapons wheel of options. Going to go over to wireframe, and I'm going to start manipulating the thickness of the trunk. So it's going to be thin on the middle and then just fat as it comes out. Then I'm going to tab into object mode, Z, and into solid, and that looks like a pretty decent trunk to me. We can create some branches also. We'll only do a couple of branches just to save time. So I'm going to go back into edit mode, and I'm going to hit Control R to create another loop cut. And then I'm going to go over to this face select option up here. So I can select the faces. Then I'm going to hit E, and that'll give us a straight extrusion perpendicular from the thing that it's being extruded from, which is really cool. And we're gonna do 1.5 for that. I'm gonna hit S and scale it down to 0.3. Now we're going to come out of edit mode, and I'm going to be in object mode, of course. We're going to hit Shift A and create a cube. Bring that cube to the top. There we are. We have our first sort of bush thing. Here we are, we have our first sort of bush thing going on here. I'm going to scale that up a little bit. 1.25 should be good. And I'm going to have a look at that in wireframe, just make sure everything's alright. So now I'm going to go over to edge select. From face select to edge select, we are in the object mode for our cube, so tab into that, and we're going to hit Control B, and that's going to give us the option to bevel off this edge. Then I'm going to use the scroll wheel and scroll up a few times to create 3 segments, and now we have a nice rounded curve on our object. Do that a couple more times. Alright, now we've beveled a few edges. I just wanted to show off that tool because we hadn't used it before. In object mode, I'm going to hit Shift D and duplicate it, and then I'm going to hit Y to move it along by the Y axis. Then I'm going to go over to the top view by selecting it here on this gizmo, bring it over to where I see it aligns with the branch. Then we're going to hit RZ, rotate it along the Z axis as much as we want. Go back to the front view, hit GZ, move that down in line with the branch, S, scale it along on everything, and that's gonna look alright for me. Real quick, we'll just check on the wireframe. G, RZ. I just like things lining up nicely. And we'll do the same with the other branch. Awesome, so 1 tree, 3 branches, 3 sets of shrubbery. And that'll give us an easy way to work with our level of detail. Last thing we're going to do is just add some simple materials to these. So I'm gonna select the object, go to the materials tab, and then I'm gonna hit new. Just gonna make a color for these, so nothing too fancy. So I'll go over to base color, and when I click in the white box, it'll give me a color picker. In the color picker, just pick whatever color you want. I am inclined to go for some pink, so a nice rich pink there. And if we go into look dev, we can see the tone of our materials. Now I'm going to select the other set of shrubbery, and instead of hitting new on the drop down, I'm just going to use that material that we created already. Same with this one, same material. And then for this one, the trunk, we'll create a new material, and I'm going to make this hopefully a piney brown. There we go. So we've got our material set up for our tree. And at this point, it would be a good time to hit Control S and save your object. So you can save the Blender file wherever you want. The most important part is where we save the FBX. I'm going to delete the camera and the light source so that we don't accidentally export that. And then I'm going to go to File, Export, and we're going to go to FBX. Main is good, Z forward, all of these settings are good. We're just going to go for mesh here, none of the other stuff, and then we're going to export it into our actual project. So we've got to find our project first. So I export it into my assets folder for my project. So export FBX. Now we hop back into Unity. So now we're back in Unity and we're going to create some trees. Now we'll go over to the exported object and we're going to move it into the scene view so we can play around with it and then create a prefab of it. All we have right now is a mesh and some other stuff. Going to add a couple of components to this. The first component being a classic rigid body. So nice and easy. We're going to set it to is kinematic because we don't want it falling through our terrain. And then we're going to go to add component again, and LOD group is the next thing that we will add. And you can already see that it's saying something about something being cold. I'm going to hit F to zoom into my tree and we're going to take a look at what these LODs are all about. Okay, so when we are close to our tree, we want a particular level of detail. So we're going to dictate what gets rendered out when we are super close to our tree. And that is going to be all of the assets tied to our object. So I'll hit add, and then we're going to select cube, add, cube 1. Now what would have been fantastic practice is to actually name these properly in Blender. Double click each time, by the way. So that we have no confusion on what these objects are, because it is also wanting to reference objects from this scene. But what I'm seeing here is that it helps us out a little bit by giving us this little icon next to it. Okay, now that we've added that for a 100% level of detail, I'm going to go over to 60, so slide it out to 60, and you can see that it's still waiting for some objects for us to render out. I'm going to go to cylinder, and that is going to be our trunk. I'm also going to select the biggest piece of leafage that we have there. And then we're going to go for the second biggest piece of leafage, which I believe was actually the last block that we added. And we'll leave that last one out. And then LOD at 30%, we're going to say, all right, let's just have the initial cylinder and the biggest piece of shrubbery there. And then when we're a max distance away, we are not going to render out that tree, thus saving ourselves loads of resources. Now that we've done that, we can go back to the terrain. We'll create a prefab out of this tree. So I'm going to drag it into my prefab folder, original prefab, and I can safely delete this now. Then we're going to go to the Paint Trees tab under our terrain, and I'm going to go to Edit Trees, Add Tree, and a little menu like this will pop up, and I'm going to go for tree demo, and that is the one in my prefabs folder, so it shows us nicely that it's in my prefab folder. And then I will add that. We have a paintbrush, as we always do, and if I zoom in, then hopefully we can see that we have a nice cluster of trees there, and the level of detail on these trees varies depending on how close we are. And then I'm going to hit Control Z and mess around with my tree density. I'm going to bring it back to about 20 so that we don't have too high of a density of trees. And again, if I hit Shift and then click, I can actually clear out my trees. So we still want that opening for our dojo, but that is something that we are going to do in our next part, because I'm just looking at the recording time, and this is going to be an absolutely wamped part. But we've gone through all of the terraining tools that are locked into our terrain object, so that's really good. If you guys enjoyed this, then stick around because we're going to be focusing on that dojo as I said, should be a very quick and simple part. It will be where I can show you how to export your textures properly when you export that FBX for a model. So be looking forward for that in the future. But otherwise, guys, have fun with this, do your own thing, press on and keep creating.